Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome, everyone. I'm really honored this morning to be moderating this panel of esteemed speakers and leaders from not only the Southern racial justice movement, but a national racial justice movement that's rooted in the South. When we put this panel, this plenary together, we really struggled with the title. And one of the struggles was really based on a tension that I think we're going to explore today during our conversation. And that tension is, who are we speaking to? As Southerners, or people living in the South, living and loving in the South, organizing in the South, oftentimes we are speaking outside of our region. We're speaking to a national audience. And other times we are speaking among ourselves and addressing each other. And that tension is reflective of a lot of the ways in which we do our organizing and do our work straddling tensions. And sometimes we think of tension as a bad word, but if you think about it, tension is simply something that's being pulled in two directions. We have bridges, amazing bridges, that exist because of tension. And we've been able to accomplish and move many things because of the energy that comes from recognizing that we're pulled in two different directions. So when we first put the panel together, I was worried that we would have to explain what is the South, right? But for those of us who live in the South, that's not really a question, right? We recognize that for many people across the country, the South is especially in the racial justice movement, the South is a mysterious boogeyman, right? A place that has a bloody and painful history, sometimes that eclipses the blood and the pain that exists in the rest of the country. It's very real. But for those of us in the region, many of us recognize that it's a complex and diverse place that transcends a lot of these kind of misconceptions, and it defies monolith. It is not one place and it can't be explained in one way. And so we use the very complex and rich word home. And so what we're going to talk about today is that tension, those roots that are buried deep and those wings that are carrying us forward. That past that so many people think they know, think they understand, but is so much more complex. And the wings, the future, the innovation that a lot of people don't know is actually happening in the South. Some of the most cutting edge work, some of the most diverse and complex communities, some of the most multi is happening in the South. And so we're going to break it down. I'm going to stop because it's right here in this genius on this stage, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce at first each panelist, and then they're going to talk a little bit about their work, and we're going to go one by one. It's my great pleasure to begin with Bishop Tonyia Rawls, who I know best through Race Forward's innovative and exciting work in the Better Together project. If you were at the Better Together happy hour last night, you know it's a beautiful collection of people who are doing both racial justice work and LGBTQ liberation in the South. Bishop Rawls is the founder and executive director of the Freedom Center for Social Justice. It's in the Carolinas, in North Carolina. And it was founded in 2009, and since its launch, it's the first LGBTQ law center and it launched the first LGBTQ law center and transgender employment project. In addition to her work as a spiritual leader and social justice activist, she has been a reviewer for the Journal of African American Studies and is published in Black Sexualities, Probing Powers, Passions, Practices, and Policies. Bishop Rawls is a graduate of Duke University and sits on the governing board of the North Carolina Council of Churches. Bishop?
Thank you. It's all right, it's all right, it's all right, it's all right. Since my soul's got a seat in the kingdom, it's all right. It's all right, it's all right, it's all right, it's all right. Since my soul's got a seat in the kingdom, it's all right. I'm still processing the way that the Reagans disturbed me last night. I had to go and stream some music to unbundle from some of that. And it was wonderful preparation for today's panel discussion because it really spoke to this kind of core way that Southern organizing happens. In the work that we do with the Freedom Center for Social Justice, I need to go back another step. I wound up in North Carolina to open the Unity Fellowship Church's church movement's first congregation in the Bible Belt. And it's a denomination that is predominantly LGBTQ, predominantly people of color, and people thought that I was absolutely crazy to leave Washington, D.C., where I was working as a marketing consultant and doing all of this other work. I was also assistant pastor of our church there. And it was really thought that there was absolutely no way that you would have gay folk come out in Charlotte, North Carolina. What was fascinating in reference to this was to see what transpired, and this was in 2000, where we opened with just my partner of 16 years, Gwendolyn, and I coming into this city and having built some wonderful relationships in our visits back and forth before the initial launch of our work, to see that not only would people come, but they would come in ways that had them drive 4 hours each way, in some instances, just to find a safe space to worship. And so as opposed to a neighborhood church, we wound up having this multi-state experience of predominantly black people of color, black and people of color who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer identified. It was impossible to do that work and not also engage in social justice issues. The swath of need was so vast, and the approach to our work always was, at its core, very intersectional. I want to say that kind of like grits, somebody gonna get this, but there's a reason we don't say soul food in the South, because grits, everybody eats grits, right? And I want to say white people can cook grits in the South, okay? They can cook some grits, they can cook some greens. It is a common kind of thing for many of us. What I want to fast forward to in laying that foundation is this notion of Southern organizing. And it is a thing, but it is a thing that somehow seems like it just came on the radar as people are talking about it. It's things that have been happening for generations, and it is rich and it is powerful. And it is needed, I want to say, in the social justice movement at this time. One of the greatest challenges many of us faced was when somehow the progressive movement felt the need to distance itself from her Southern counterpart. And in that distancing, we unfortunately, unlike others, did not take advantage of the incredible power that did and still does reside there. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and my hope is that those who are listening are not listening to it from this frame of, oh, isn't that wonderful work they're doing down there in the South? My hope is that this will be where our sharing will be something that others will see as potentially work that can be replicated in varied other segments of the country and even the world, because it is happening and it is powerful, and those roots run very deep. So I'm looking forward to hearing from my other co-panelists, and I thank you for this opportunity because it's all right.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Chokwe Antar Lumumba, an attorney and movement leader in Jackson, Mississippi. Sing it, Jackson. I'm gonna stop doing that in a minute, Raul, sorry. His firm, Lumumba and Associates, is deeply dedicated to community and service through their pro bono work. Antar is also a media chairperson for the Jackson Ward 2 People's Assembly and is an active member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement. His talent for organizing served as a vital component to previous city elections as he served as media chairperson and campaign coordinator for his father's successful bids for Ward 2 city councilman and mayor, respectively. And we will be remembering the late Mayor Chokwe Lumumba later in the program today. He played a key role in the crafting of the People's Platform as co-author to the inspired document. Chokwe Antar's lifelong objective is to continue to struggle on behalf of oppressed peoples worldwide so that they may eventually obtain the self-determined lives they so justly deserve. He's also a husband and a new father, having welcomed his first child this past March.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction and for all those kind words. I'll pay you later. Thank you so much. I'm truly honored to be here to speak on this panel. I honestly don't know how I even was chosen to sit amongst such a collection of great minds and dedicated individuals, and the honor is all mine. What I come from, and I'd like to give a shout out to all of my people in the audience who are from Mississippi. I heard you. All right. Okay. I am a child of the struggle, right? And for me to talk about what my work is at this time, I have to inform you of that so that you know my background. We spoke of my father, Chokwe Lumumba, but my mother was a powerful force in her own right, Nubia Lumumba. And what my parents decided to do, they were two individuals that were so dedicated to struggle that instead of shying back from all the pressures that struggle when you're dealing with things such as exploited people, racism, and social and economic justice, people often try to shy away from approaching controversial things that they feel that that which they hold dear to them, their family, could be compromised as a result. What my parents did is that they made the calculated decision to give what they held most dear to the struggle. And so they dedicated their family to it, and they thought that teaching us of the struggle was an important part of nurturing their children, right? And so that's why we moved to Mississippi, right? And so though I may not be worthy of being on this panel, the discussion of Mississippi certainly is. Because we can't talk about oppression in the South, we can't talk about oppression, period, unless we're prepared to talk about Mississippi, right? We're prepared to talk about Mississippi, yeah. And we all are aware of Mississippi's history and the great atrocities that have taken place in Mississippi. But we also have to recognize the opportunity which is presented in Mississippi, and that's why my parents moved there. Mississippi is pregnant with opportunity, right? It's pregnant with opportunity. If you look at the demographics of Mississippi, Mississippi has the highest percentage of black people in the country. It's approximately 40%, right? And so if you're really talking about organizing, if you're really talking about what I see is Mississippi being the greatest opportunity of moving from the politics of what has been to the politics of what needs to be, right? Mississippi is where you have to start, right? And so what we've worked with in my work, continuing what my father's vision was, is we've interjected ourselves into electoral politics, right? And you have to understand that our work has graduated to that point because that hasn't always been the approach, is to go through the electoral process. But we feel that it was an opportunity, and when I say we, as Rosana mentioned, my father had successful bids for city councilman in the city of Jackson, and then he later rose to become mayor of the city of Jackson. And what he was attempting to do, and what we're still trying to do, is use the electoral process, right, to influence policy and conditions which can empower the people to empower themselves, right? And so what we believe is in a collective method of leadership. And so that's what we're trying to approach. Now what we're doing, and I was unsuccessful in my bid for mayor. We missed it, just shy of where we needed to be, but the work still continues. Because our work wasn't just about being in electoral politics, our work was about trying to reach our end, and that is to change the conditions for the people that we see that are oppressed in Mississippi and serve as an example to the world, right? Because if you can achieve it right there in the belly of the beast, you can do it anywhere, right? And so that's where we stand now, and we'll get into some of the initiatives that we're working on now, such as the People's Assembly and Cooperation Jackson. I see that I am getting the cue card that my time is running short here, so as we continue in this discussion, I'll explain those things. Thank you so much.
And last but certainly not least, I'm honored to introduce Cristina Tzintzún. She's the executive director of the Workers' Defense Project, a statewide membership-based workers' rights organization that is winning better working conditions for Texans. At WDP, Tzintzún has spearheaded efforts to ensure safe and dignified jobs for the nearly 900,000 construction workers that labor in the state. Her work has led to a federal investigation by OSHA into Texas's deadly construction industry, the passage of a statewide wage theft law, and better, safer jobs for thousands of low-wage workers in Austin and Travis County. Her work has been covered in the New York Times, National Public Radio, Univision, and USA Today. And I'm so pleased to ask a big round of applause for Cristina Tzintzún.
I just wanted to welcome everyone to Texas. I'm glad you all came and decided to do it here, so you could pick any southern state, so I'm glad that my other folks from the South got to come to Texas. As mentioned, I lead an organization that's a statewide workers' rights organization, and we do this work in one of the most difficult political climates in the country, and the folks that we represent nearly are all undocumented workers. And I could give you stats and figures about the fact that we're taking on a $72 billion industry that is the largest contributor to the Republican Party, that controls the governors, the lieutenant governor, the Capitol, and nearly every place in this state. Or the fact that the industry that we're taking on is the largest employer of the undocumented workforce. And I could give you all kinds of stats and figures about that, but I don't want to do that. I really want to talk about the human cost that our policies in Texas of putting profit consistently before people have on the people that live and work in this state. So one of the people that come to our organization, so you can understand what we're up against, is a worker like Santiago Arias. Now, he was from Houston, and he came to our organization like many workers do after he was injured on a job. His employer didn't want to pay $50 for a harness that he needed to work several stories up doing demolition work. And if you know anything about demolition work, it's really dangerous and dirty work. And so he was working, and then he fell several stories. And they were able to call an ambulance, and he was rushed to a hospital, and they were able to save his life. But Santiago today is now a quadriplegic. He'll never work or walk again. And he left the hospital with close to $1 million in medical bills. And when he also left the hospital, he learned that his employer didn't carry workers' compensation insurance, which would have paid for those medical bills and would have paid to compensate for him and his family to take care of them, because we are the only state in the entire country that doesn't require workers' compensation insurance. It's a privilege to have it here in Texas. So Santiago sued his employer, but he only ever saw close to $100,000, which went straight to pay for his medical bills, because while there was insurance on the property to cover materials and the building, there was no insurance to cover the people who build the state. And that's the reality of what we're up against. Now, Santiago was actually considered somewhat fortunate in that he's married, so he has a full-time caretaker, his wife, who now feeds him, bathes him, and he's also lucky because Texas is the most deadly place to work in the country, and at its peak, there was a construction worker dying in the state every 2.5 days. And if you asked our governor, which he was asked, well, what do you have to say about the fact that so many construction workers are dying building your state that you say is this big economic miracle? The comment was, well, when you have more building and you're making more money, there may be more accidents. So even, I want to tell this story so you understand the political context of what we're up against in this state. But even with being up against so many challenges, our members are making tremendous gains. People that have everything against them, people of color, undocumented, don't speak English, are winning. Our members have passed 2 statewide laws in just the last few years that are better protecting the rights of thousands of workers. They've taken on some of the largest corporations in the world right here in Texas to demand safer working conditions, living wages, and they've won. And right now in this audience, some of our members are here from Dallas, and they're organizing to pass a law that would give 225,000 construction workers that live and work in this city the right to paid rest breaks, because they have to go outside and work in 100-degree heat and don't even have the right to that here in Texas. And I think that they're going to win. And it's that kind of work that I have the privilege to be a part of here in the South. That clearly isn't as the same as, we're not talking about winning a citywide $15 living wage ordinance, but these are tremendous gains. But we will be asking for that living wage when we can, and we're building power over the long haul. And the last thing I want to just say is that I think doing work in the South is some of the most difficult and challenging work if you're a progressive like we are. But I also think it's incredibly fun. When I have to go talk to other groups in other parts of the state and talk about the organizing we do here in Texas, a lot of times people tell me that they feel sorry for me, that it must be really hard to do this work, and it is. But I think when you're at rock bottom, you can only go up, and that's exactly what the communities here are doing.
So one of the principles that we organize by is making sure our people are taken care of. So we're just making sure. I'm going to model a little bit of important movement self-care and drink a little bit of water. Before we get into this really, I wanted to just start off with Blast. I wanted to really go up and talk about all of the amazing innovation that's happening in the South. At Race Forward, we're really focused on innovation. We're really focused on racial justice solutions. And I think that sometimes we need to tell our friends who are outside the region, don't sleep on us because it's happening right here. And some of the most exciting and cutting edge work is happening. So I actually wanted to start with Cooperation Jackson and ask Chokwe to kind of kick us off, because many of us were at Jackson Rising in May, and what's happening there and the Jackson Plan is just a model that I think other cities need to follow across the country. So we'll ask Chokwe first, and then Bishop, and then Christina.
Okay, thank you. What we have employed in Jackson as 2 innovative approaches to reach the end that we seek is one, the implementation of what we call a People's Assembly, right? Which is an opportunity for people to come from all areas of the community and voice their concerns, their social concerns. We talk about issues within the city such as economic issues. We talk about economic development. It ranges from everything to health and beyond. And that's an opportunity which we see as a counterweight to the government, right? And that's supposed to operate outside of government, right? So that people, one, have the opportunity to be informed as to the things that are happening in their community, but they can also inform those officials of what they want to see go on in their community, right? And so that's a dual power that operates independent of the government, and that's something, regardless of whether we're in office or not, has to always function, and it should always function in and of itself. The other thing is Cooperation Jackson that we've talked about. When we sought office and we sought an opportunity to represent people through electoral politics, we asked the question. We said, how do we make Jackson rise? And so we also offered an answer, and we said the people must decide. They must be educated, motivated, and organized. And so what Cooperation Jackson is, it's an innovative approach to address things such as community wealth building. And so what we're trying to do, one thing that we've recently done is opened up the Chokwe Lumumba Center for Economic Democracy and Development. And what we're trying to incorporate in that is the development of worker cooperatives, so that we can build businesses within the city that the workers can decide how they work, what the fruits of their labor will be, and they have control of those businesses. One issue that Jackson presents that I'm certain that other cities might be able to relate to is that Jackson does not have a problem of producing wealth. Jackson has a problem of maintaining wealth. All of the dollars that are earned in the city of Jackson between 9 and 5 are out by 6, right? And so you have this depleting resource to the suburban areas which all the wealth exists, right? And to give you an understanding of what Jackson looks like, Jackson is about 80 to 85% black, right? And so you have a circumstance where people do not have the financial means to control the circumstances and the conditions within their community. So that's why we present the option of cooperative businesses, which is very innovative and new to Mississippi, right? Mississippi does not have, first of all, Mississippi has legislation which does not allow for the incorporation of cooperatives in the state of Mississippi, right? It's too close to socialism for Mississippi, right? And so, so it's obviously very innovative, not to say that we don't have cooperative, at least 1 or 2 cooperative businesses that are incorporated in other states, but it's obviously an innovative approach to the state of Mississippi. And so we see it as very important because if we see that there's a void of wealth for the citizens, right? We see that there is a depletion of resources and depletion of jobs that move out of the city. Then what our solution is that we should create jobs where you own the business yourself, right? Where the workers have control of the businesses and they have say-so on whether those businesses leave or whether they stay, right? And that's really important. That's really important. And so thank you. We just acquired the Lumumba Center, right? The other thing that we're trying to do is sustainable initiatives for the city. What we're trying to do is create green jobs. We're sticking with the trends and living in a more environmentally friendly condition. And so these are the things that we're trying to introduce. Yeah.
So I want to just say a little disclaimer. When I opened up with "My soul has a seat in the kingdom and it's all right," that line in that song transcends the Christian platform, and it was really about the fact that there can be struggle and challenge, but the thing that keeps us engaged in this crazy hard work is that somehow we're able to see the better place. And so that's important to note for anybody that got conflicted in that song. To that point, I want to say that it is nearly impossible to think about organizing in the South and have major struggles with faith. The role of faith in Southern organizing is a critical one. And it is one that is both gift and challenge. It is, when I talked about the opening work as a pastor in Charlotte, North Carolina, and at the time that I came into Charlotte, there really was not a lot of organized activity happening with the LGBTQ community. People were not coming out. They were not, and for understandable reasons. People aren't all crazy who don't want to come out in some of these settings, just keeping it real. But when you get that kind of collective effort that begins to happen, and you also help people to understand the power of their voice and their vote, many, many things are possible. And so with the Freedom Center for Social Justice, we began just starting out with a core issue like HIV and AIDS, which was in Charlotte at the time that we began the work, 1 in 3 black men who identified as gay or bisexual was HIV positive if they were under the age of 22. Right, that's an epidemic of incredible proportion. And no one was talking about it, not even black gay men. And so we came in and really just started the work there. And I want to give a quick story of Reverend Donnie Garris, who is pastor of Antioch Missionary Baptist Church. We were both asked to speak on HIV and AIDS in the black community. And again, the only way that people tend to be able to have conversation about black community was it was always pathologized. There's always the next thing that's wrong with the black folk in the South, right? And so we started this, he had this conversation, and I felt to introduce myself to him because people told me there were no black preachers who would ever be willing to talk to me, definitely not as an out black lesbian that was pastoring. To be honest, I thought that my orientation would be the big issue. My gender far out-trumped. They could care less who I slept with. The fact that I had breasts was a problem, okay? And it totally blindsided me, but I just wasn't ready for that. But it was real, and it was these lines we had to cross over. But we had a chance to talk, and what I found was that while he would not publicly come out against these big issues, particularly those that connected with LGBTQ people, privately, he was much more moderate than his position publicly. What that ultimately led to was us broadening the circle in conversations because we were all concerned about HIV and AIDS, and particularly because of the fact that young black girls were some of the ones that were getting infected at a faster rate than anybody, and it was not gay boys getting them infected, okay? So we had to talk about those conversations. It led to the building of a relationship with a large number of black conservative preachers who ultimately grew to the point that while we could not agree upon what the Bible said about homosexuality, what we could agree upon was the fact that we were concerned about the plight of young black people. And what we could agree upon was the fact that as clergy, we had a responsibility, and at the very least, I was charged to cause no harm. I want to state that to say that one of the things when you're doing the kind of work we do in the South, it is critical to make sure that you do not let outside forces frame what success looks like. You can't do it. Success in terms of growing so that you can get a harness for a worker, that's a huge win. Being able to say we have a collective of small businesses that are coming together. No, huge policy may not have been changed, but that's like a crazy big win. When you get black Southern preachers to be willing to say, I am willing at least to cause no harm with the words that I speak, that becomes big. That ultimately elevated to a place where we started talking about other things together that we were concerned about. In fact, actually, we created a coalition called Black Clergy United Against AIDS, and it has grown in ways that we're now working together as close colleagues on many things. And I want to just quickly give a snapshot about the work we're doing with the Moral Freedom Summer, what we just recently came through. That was a body of work that actually began because our government, and I just have to say, just in a moment of silence, so this past election, we now have a conservative House, a conservative Senate, a conservative governor, and a conservative court. Amen. So our court attempted to do an amendment a few years ago called Amendment 1 that was designed to be a poison pill so that gay folk could never get the right to marry. That was the short of it. And what it was an amendment that said, even though it was already illegal to get married in the state, we want a policy, a change in the Constitution that says no other relationship can be recognized except that between a man and a woman getting married. What they were willing to sacrifice in that swath was every domestic partnership within the state of North Carolina. Only 14% were gay. The fear that they had around the possibility that rights could be extended to the gay community was such that they were willing to sacrifice their own women and sons and daughters and nieces and nephews that this happened. The gift of that moment, which is why we talk about the fact that, while the work is hard, it actually is an environment and region that is pregnant with possibility. Because of that headiness, you had black clergy who now said, now wait a minute now, you're going too far. You can't be messing with people shacking up and living together. Let's leave that alone. And that's my congregation, leave them alone, leave them alone. And, and it created a fascinating bedfellow. And that work ultimately wound up growing to the point that now we have the state NAACP as one of the biggest allies for the LGBTQ community. We now have gay marriage recognized in the state of North Carolina. We now have groups that are working together and fighting on a range of fronts, unapologetic about how big the table now has become. It's these kind of moments and these kind of models that are deep in the roots of relational experiences that make all kind of things possible.
Across the country and look at progressive movements happening, that there's been so much focus on work happening at the municipal level that I think is so creative and inspiring. For a workers' rights organization, we look to what just happened in Seattle a few months ago, where they passed the highest living wage. And in Texas, we know that we are the largest minimum wage job creator in the country. And so we wanted to raise the wages of workers here too. But in the state of Texas, we passed a law in the early 2000s that made it illegal for any municipality or any county to create a wage that is higher than the federal minimum wage, is what we have in Texas. But that doesn't mean, going back to solutions that you can craft locally, that doesn't mean that we gave up. Texas also gives out more tax cuts to corporations than any other state. In fact, it's about $19 billion a year. It accounts from our local, state, and county government. It makes up a quarter of all corporate handouts come from Texas nationally. So what were we getting in return? It wasn't really clear what we were getting in return. So our organization, came to our attention that Apple, it's a small company, who has heard of a company called Apple? Okay, well they got close to $30 million in tax breaks about a year and a half ago to come build one of their largest facilities in our backyard in Austin, Travis County. And we asked the city, well, it's going to require thousands of construction workers to build this project. What are they going to get in return? What kind of wages are they going to get? And no one in the city could tell us. No one had ever even asked that before. And so we said, well, we demand that they have a living wage. We demand that they have safe working conditions. And we also demand that we get to monitor those standards from start to finish of that project to make sure that workers get those standards, to make sure that they're being treated fairly. And so we won that, and then now it's the permanent policy in the city of Austin, because we fought after that. The city got tired of us showing up every single time that they were going to do one of these tax deals with hundreds of workers in their chambers and making them stay till 4 o'clock in the morning. And so now it's permanent policy in the city of Austin that if any company is going to give these tax breaks, they have to pay to long-term employees a living wage. They have to have same-sex partner benefits for long-term employees. And for contract workers and janitorial workers that were totally overseen in any of these agreements, they also have to be paid a living wage or a prevailing wage, which is union speak for union wages. Whichever is higher, they have to have these higher safety standards. And if you don't agree to do that, you don't get these tax breaks. And if you know anything about Austin, it's considered to be the progressive little bubble in Texas, but it's not on race and class issues, I can tell you that. But now we're going to take what we won in Austin and we're going to win it in we're going to move to win it in Dallas and Houston and every major city that's happening.
I just want to lift up that one of the beautiful things that I've learned in watching the organizing that our three speakers are involved in is that there is a beautiful both and happening in this work. And so that's been a really important thing that, you know, we yesterday Rinku talked about living in the and so I'm going to move into a different kind of and, which is multiracial organizing in the South. And I think that one of the things is that when people look at the South, and definitely, I grew up in Miami, I lived in Atlanta for a lot of years, and then I moved to New Orleans. So I've had a really distinctive experience of living in the South. And there are three very different, very multiracial places with huge immigrant populations. A lot of people don't know New Orleans is home to the largest Honduran population in the country. It's home to the third largest Vietnamese population in the country. And we're across the region, we're often the largest and fastest growing immigrant population per capita, right? So we want to talk a little bit about the amazing multiracial organizing that's happening in the South and organizing across race lines. And so I'd like to start with Christina and then come down the line to talk a little bit about that. And we're going to do it quickly so that we have time for the third question and then any questions from the audience. So 2 minutes, please.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm a fast talker, so that's usually not my problem. But, so, I mean, one of the strongest parts about our work, I think, is clearly we're representing an industry that's mostly brown at this point, mostly immigrant, and mostly undocumented. And if you look at the labor movement, you know, unions have been one of the most important institutions to really breaking down barriers for workers of color, of getting them the good jobs that are in a certain industry. But they're not necessarily haven't necessarily always been welcoming to including women, immigrants, and people of color, and especially in the construction industry. And so 10 years ago when we were getting started, we went to the construction unions and we said, we want to work with you to raise standards for construction workers. Here's who our members are. Most of them, nearly all of them, weren't part of unions because they were undocumented. And at the time, mostly these white trade unions told us, scoffed at us. We weren't going to work with you. You guys were our competition. And you were representing, quote, illegal workers at the time. And we could have closed the door to them. We could have said, you know, thought of them as backwards or out of touch or racist. But we told them that we believed that we shared a common vision and mission with them, that all workers deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, and that they had access to resources that our members didn't have, and that we believed that they deserved those. And so we always kept that door open to them, and we showed them that we could win, that we were capable of winning better working conditions for our members and their members. And today they're one of our most important allies, and that's what I'm most proud of, is I have big burly white construction workers that had never before talked to an immigrant worker before, standing and fighting with us for immigration reform, standing and fighting with us at the state legislature, and they now see that the value in their work and how they're going to rebuild the labor movement here in Texas is by working with the immigrant community, by working with workers of color.
The understanding of being able and prepared to work across racial lines is absolutely essential. If we're talking about the history of exploitation, the history of oppression, what we have to understand is anytime you're trying to fight that, if you see yourself as an oppressed person historically, then you have to make certain that your agenda is to not replicate that oppression that you feel has been suffered, right? In Mississippi, we're moving to a more diverse place. Growing up, there were, two categories of race. You're either black or white, but we're moving to a more diverse place as we're growing. And so there's a lot of things that have to be understood in the politics of how that works, right? And so that's why things such as the People's Assembly that we're trying to employ is so important, because what the People's Assembly offers, it offers an opportunity for people to contribute to the developing politics of the city from whatever place you come from whatever background you come from. There's a lot that we need to understand that you can't really talk about the issue of race without being prepared to talk about economic injustice, right? And there is so much, there's a nexus between our issues, right? And so if we can explain those things to people, the issue that you really suffer from is an issue of economic justice, then you see that what divides us, right? We really have a lot more similarity than you might think, right? You have, for instance, you have the sentiment that I'm certain people may have heard in whatever area of the country you come from, where you have people who are fighting for jobs, that the job is the problem, but instead they get caught up in issues of race and conversations which are not beneficial to the development of where we go, right? You have black people who talk about the immigrant population which comes in and says, well, they're stealing the jobs, right? Well, the reality, if it was your job to begin with, no one could take it, right? And so what we need to work on is opportunities to build community wealth building so that we can all share and benefit from the same opportunities. My position is that I don't care whether you arrived on the Mayflower or you came across the border yesterday. You deserve the same rights and privileges that anybody else does. Yeah.
This is a great question, and it's great because as the title of this discussion speaks to, it's talking about roots. And some of the power of Southern organizing is that it really does run very deep in its roots, which makes a lot of other things possible as we start to share the fruit that comes from that growth. The interesting thing about the immigrant conversation and other conversations around racial identities beyond black and white is that some of these are new conversations. So when thinking about the work that we did with the Moral Freedom Summer and also just the moral movement work that the Freedom Center for Social Justice has been engaged in for many years now, it was the first time we saw labor kind of really playing a central role with us, definitely as related to LGBTQ issues. And you have to understand, we live in a state in North Carolina that is not a union state. In fact, it is totally anti anything that remotely looks unionized. So when we had other unions who were engaging, that was new work, but we did have the construction workers and we did have undocumented citizens and all of these individuals coming together. And to see, I remember a really powerful moment in one of our gatherings where we had this, nearly 250,000 people gathered for this moral movement action that we had, and to see young undocumented citizens standing up and talking about why these issues of poverty, of over-incarceration, we all had the same issues. And so what is exciting is to see what is possible now that the frame has been broadened. The frame is not just about black and white. The fastest growing population in North Carolina is the Latino community. It is not the black community. It is not white folk. It is the influx we have in North Carolina of many people from Latin backgrounds. And so I think that the possibilities are literally limitless. The question becomes, what is this relationship that others outside of the South have with us? And that's a conversation we don't always like to have, but it is a conversation that's going to be increasingly important, especially the closer we get to 2016. And if we don't figure how to have those conversations very quickly, we're going to be leaving a lot of stuff on the table that unfortunately will not benefit the progressive movement, will not benefit local communities. And so part of why I was very honored and humbled to have the opportunity to have this conversation is that I want to suggest that we are really missing some huge opportunities as progressives by continually pathologizing the South and not seeing her as an incredible asset to the broader movement.
So I just need clarity. So can we do one more question and then question from the audience? Awesome. So we're gonna, are folks circulating or just scribble on a scrap of paper hold it up in the air. There should be people circulating to collect any questions from the audience. We're going to do our last stage question, which is really about, speaking of assets, our cultural assets, right? We are a diverse region with incredible culture all across the South, and it is certainly, speaking from the different cities that I've lived in, it's not just soul food and Creole food in New Orleans. It's not just talking about the freedom songs that we opened with, which are an incredibly important part, but there's also so much that we contribute culturally to the rest of the country. And so I wanted to talk about the ways in which we, through food, through art, through song, engage culture in our organizing work. And so we'll start on this end and move our way back in 2 minutes.
I want to give a quick story. I was reminded of it when I first came to Charlotte, because we were just starting a new ministry. I needed a job, right? Because I didn't have any congregants at that time. So I needed a job. And my job was with the good fortune of being able to link with SciCon and grassroots leadership. And I became their first director of communications. And I remember we had, and the mission of our organization was to fight the growth of the private prison industry within the South. So I remembered, amen. I realize my amen slips out. It's an occupational hazard, so please just forgive me. But I remembered I had come back from the Mississippi Delta. We were working with some workers in the Delta who were, their choice basically was a chicken farm or a private prison. And it's hard to have a conversation when you're talking about poverty, and the chicken industry is an incredibly toxic industry for those who aren't familiar with chickens. And I know we like to eat it and stuff, but it's a thing. And so, and so I was having conversations with this older woman. We were going through the community and doing organizing. And I remember coming back and I was sharing my frustration because I'm sitting in a meeting, I'm wanting to get to the issue about this private prison. And the woman says, would you like some sweet tea? And I said, yeah. Now, mind you, I have to just give the disclaimer, I'm fresh out of DC when I'm having this conversation, so that's a whole thing unto itself. And then she says, well, tell me about your mama and them. And then goes on to ask me where they from, and on and on. It took 15 or 20 minutes before I could finally get to talk about what I came to talk about. I come back frustrated, and I said, well, listen, I can't even believe how long it took to have this conversation. He said, for the meeting to start, he said, the meeting started when she said, do you want some tea? And how's your mama and them? And it was the power of the stories that were shared between us that actually left us with a relationship that was deep enough that she became my greatest ally in that area. It wasn't about the private prison. It was about my discussion with me and Uncle Sammy in Savannah, Georgia, where we would be shipped down to Savannah from New Jersey, where I'm originally from, and spend our summers in Savannah and eating watermelon out the field. And there was a common link that we established. And then I heard her as an elder and one who could school me and inform me about what was happening in the lay of the land. But the key was I had to change my filters. I had to adjust my filters so that I could hear what was really being said beyond the words. It wasn't about the tea. It wasn't about the questions about my mama and them. It was, who are you, and how do we now figure how to work together? And I want to suggest that when there are those within progressive movement who approach organizing in the South with the parachute model, that you will never be able to reap the full benefits because you're not ready to drink the tea.
Thank you for that, Bishop. Actually, I'd like to start by saying this. When we look at the South and people determine what area they consider to be the South, some people look at, maybe the Mason-Dixon line or what have you. You know, I went to college in Alabama, law school in Texas. The way you determine whether you're in the South or not is if you go to a restaurant and you ask for sweet tea. If they have
That's
it,
right.
you're probably in the South, right?
That's right.
If someone then tells you, if you ask for sweet tea, well, we have tea and we have some sugar if you want to put in it, you probably ain't in the South, right? Everybody knows that in order to really enjoy sweet tea, it has to be boiled into the tea, right? But you know what you speak of, the culture of the South, food, and I won't just limit my discussion to that, is very important, right? Because what you have is you have a culture where you have historically poor people who have very little to offer, right? But what they usually do have to offer and to extend to you when they're greeting you or when they're meeting you is their food, right? And that food and that culture is very near and dear to them. And so it's an opening up of the door. It's an extension of the hand by offering that food to say, listen, we're welcoming you into our space, right? And so that's why the food is so good in the South, right? And if the revolution causes for me to have to give up that chicken, I might just tap out. You know? But that's important. That's important. Yeah. But the other thing is, if you're prepared to organize in the South, then one of the major components that is really important to organizing is the church, Bishop. And I know that there are people who come from various backgrounds of organizing, right? But if you're ever trying to organize in the South and you're not prepared to go into church, then you're going to have a very difficult time, right? And I know that there are people who have various spiritual beliefs. But what you have to understand when it comes to organizing is that if you can only organize people who think like you, who have the same opinions as you, then you're not much of an organizer, right? And so that is very essential to the development and the culture which exists in the South is, one, the food, and two, the spiritual component. It's you know, when you have the great the great atrocities and the tremendous history that has taken place in the South, having a spiritual understanding, you know, and grounding is very essential, very essential. And so that's why it is at the heart of the culture that we have here in the South. And so those are the things that I would really identify as the key markers of the culture that exists in the spaces which we come from. Amen. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things that I think about in organizing through arts and culture is also just about how we tell our stories. You know, so many of the folks that we represent, yes, they're a huge sector of the workforce, they're a huge sector of our communities, but by the mainstream, their stories and realities get so ignored. So it's how do you lift up those stories, but then how do you tell them in a visual way that connects with people, and also that the people that are impacted by living that inequality, by living that oppression, that they get to connect to telling their stories. So we work with our members to tell our stories, but when one year we released the number of construction workers that had been killed, it was 142 that year. And in fact, the week before we were going to release the number, it was 3 workers had been killed in our city just on one construction site alone. And so our members collected 142 work boots, and then they laid them out on the plaza, and it was the most artistic and also silent way to tell their stories without them even having to speak a word. And when they went and collected those boots from their communities and other workers, you could see the people that were missing in our community. And then the following year to the state legislature, we wanted to keep bringing up the number of workers that had been killed. So our members for 6 months created 138 coffins. That was the preceding year, the number of workers who had been killed. And they marched them to the Capitol. And if you asked anyone that worked in the Capitol, they said they'd never seen anything like it, to see that was how many bodies and how many people we were talking about missing in our community every single year, and that they had the ability to do something about it. And so I think about how we tell our stories through art is really, really important.
Okay. I literally dropped the mic, so okay, I'm good. All right. We're really short on time, so I'm just going to ask one person to volunteer to answer each question that we get to briefly. The first question is a good challenge. Folks have talked about Black, white, Latino, and just mentioned Southeast Asian. What is being done to engage First Nation people in this movement?
I can speak a little bit. One, I consider the people that we represent as First Nation people in some way, too. A lot of them are indigenous people from Latin America that come here as immigrants, but that this is very much their land, or also they're part of indigenous communities where there wasn't a border before, that this was their land. I think that if you look at other parts of the South, if you look at what happened in Arizona with SB 1070, the indigenous community there played a huge role in defending the immigrant community and saying, actually, we're all First Nation people, and even opening up some of their territory to say that this will be a safe place for immigrant communities, that we will not let the federal government come in and harass the immigrant community. And I'm speaking for the immigrants' rights movement, not necessarily the labor movement, but the immigrants' rights movement, I think, has done a tremendous job of really linking, and the native groups have been so good about opening up and really recognizing and reaching out to the immigrants' rights movement to make it have the support and solidarity that it needs.
This is another question about working with young people. We saw in Missouri that young people are rejecting folks like Al Sharpton, Jesse Jackson, and Cornel West. I think this is particularly relevant because we're seeing so much youth organizing in the South. I think there's an audience member here who won't mind if I tell the story. She went to Ferguson and she came back and she was like, they're basically acting like we're old. And so, you know, this kind of rejection of the old ways of organizing and feeling like they're not being heard. Can one of you speak to that kind of generation gap?
Yeah, this generational question is a huge one. I was impressed with Tashawn yesterday in the plenary, and something about what she said provoked something in me, and it had to do with, or caused me to reflect on this. I realized that a lot of times there is a big disconnect between the vision many young activists today have about the how and the traditional approaches, particularly when thinking about the South, is so steeped in a certain kind of frame around social justice organizing. And where the rub has come is their sense that it is quite possible that your way just does not work. If I am vested in that way, that's a disturbing conversation. And if I have fruit from that work, you then, and particularly again in the South, because in terms of culture, the culture is you don't be talking back to us. Amen. Y'all talking back. You talking back. I hear a little bass in your voice. I don't know what's up with that, right? Ease up, ease up. And and while it is not necessarily always said explicitly, it's a little implicit in this kind of undercurrent where the tension comes, where you have the young voice that as it rises up, and if any of you have teenage kids, there comes that moment when it's like that voice kind of starts elevating a little bit, and it's impacting some things. And I think we're facing that now, particularly as it relates to the progressive movement, and particularly communities of color. And I would say that broadly, not just Black, but you know, because many Black and immigrant communities, we share that together, you know? And so I'm going to answer this answer in the I. I am purposing to grow more comfortable with discomfort. And I am purposing to listen to these incredibly courageous young activists who do not speak with the same tone. The dialect is different, but the message is the same. The only thing is the dialect is different. And so we're having difficulty understanding the dialect. And so that's a frame I'm going to be taking back home with me, is this notion of it's really their dialect that's disturbing. But their what is quite powerful, and we better get it together, old folk. because they're coming for you. They're coming. They're coming.
Can I speak to that?
Yeah. One minute response, and we're not going to be able to take any more questions.
Okay, really briefly. Can you hear me? No. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. I think when we talk about this, I don't know if it's considered a changing of the guard or, the disconnect that takes place between elder and youth. What we have to first understand is historically, it's never been a smooth transition, right? You don't have, one generation say, now it's your turn, take it on, right? And so it's a battle that takes place often, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we still agree with all the approaches that are taking or the lack of maturity that may exist in certain approaches. But to be quite honest, some of our elder statesmen in the room know that there may have been some organizing that you may have been doing in the day, and you didn't necessarily take the most mature approach at that time, right? But it comes to, the quote I like to think of when we talk about the youth and them seeking the opportunity to engage into organizing. I think of Frantz Fanon. Dr. Frantz Fanon said that, look, each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it, right? Fulfill it or betray it. And that's a very powerful statement, right? That's a very powerful statement. And so, if we see young people rising up and trying to interject themselves, whether it be in Ferguson or what have you, the scenarios and the examples are endless, then we need to encourage that and also nurture that, right? And, being a child of the struggle myself, one thing that I do recognize is that when you have this generation of people coming up, there is an appreciation for the struggle, but there's also a resentment, right? There's a resentment that grows out of that because of what they feel that they missed as a result of the time that was lost from those people that were organizing. We saw that, for example, with Tupac, right? He had an internal conflict and battle that was going on with him between that organizing side and, that less mature side, maybe, yeah. Yeah.
And that's all the time that we have for our panel, because we want to take a moment, and we've been talking about this a lot as we've organized the conference. This has been a hard year for us, and we've lost so much and so many this year in the movement, and so we wanted to take just one moment of silence to remember, and in remembering somebody that I consider to be not only your father and your sister's father, but a father to our movement in many ways, a leader and a hero. I know that he would want us to also lift up the people who have passed on in this time along with him. And so as we show this picture and remember Chokwe Lumumba, we also remember with him the people who we've lost in this last year, and definitely include Renisha McBride, we include Mike Brown, we include the people here in Texas and across the country who have fallen because of police and state violence, and all of our movement leaders and heroes who are in our hearts. Thank you. Ashe.
Thank you. Free the land.
Free the
Free
land.
the land. Free the land. By any means necessary. Thank you so much.
Thank you.